for getting a healthy child. And as I mentioned before, unhealthy chromosomal arrangements or abnormal chromosomal arrangements often lead to miscarriage or birth defects. So selecting for healthy chromosomal arrangements is always paramount, but some people are selecting for biological sex. And indeed, some couples who can conceive naturally are opting for IUI in order to be able to select biological sex because of this ability to spin out the sperm samples to different fractions and select the male or female sperm. That is the sperm that would give rise to a male or female offspring. So this is a rapidly emerging theme, believe it or not. Who knew? And of course, it has nothing to do with Aristotle's assertions about what people are thinking about at the point of ejaculation, nor does it have anything to do with body position at the point of ejaculation. But I do find it rather interesting that even in this day and age, people seem to be continually pursuing new and different ways to understand why one sperm or another sperm happens to fertilize the egg. And when that information is not available, because frankly, it's not available yet, we don't know why a sperm containing a Y chromosome or a sperm containing an X chromosome is more likely to fertilize an egg. I mean, there's some ideas, for instance, that older fathers tend to have more daughters as opposed to sons. But when you really look at the data, it's pretty mixed. So if you've heard that before, has a particular nickname that I'm not going to describe on the podcast. You can look it up online. But if any of you are aware of any other kind of ideas or lore, no matter how ridiculous or crazy, please put them in the comment section on YouTube. I'd be very curious to learn about those, mostly out of interest and curiosity. But look, sometimes these outrageous stories, such as notions of body position and how they influence biological sex, even though they turn out not to be true, turn out to be interesting for other reasons. And in fact, next we're going to talk about how body position during sexual intercourse can, in fact, influence fertility and pregnancy. So another common theme around fertility and pregnancy that you'll hear about is that for couples that are trying to get pregnant, that during intercourse, they should do whatever it is that works for them. But then after the man ejaculates, that the woman should try and position her ankles above her head or somehow otherwise tilt her pelvis back in order to increase the rate and or probability that the sperm swim toward the egg as opposed to the other direction. Now, I talked to a couple of different OBGYNs and urologists that are focused on fertility about this topic. And it turns out you get pretty mixed answers as to whether or not there's any validity to this idea that the woman's body position after the man ejaculates inside of her can somehow influence the probability of pregnancy. One group of experts told me that there is no reason for a woman to need to continue to lie down, elevate the ankles, or in any way tilt her pelvis back in order to increase the probability of successful fertilization. The other group suggested that indeed there is a strong reason to believe that tilting the pelvis back, maybe even keeping the ankles elevated and having a woman lie on her back for about 15 minutes with the pelvis positioned at about 20 degrees back is ideal for optimizing fertilization. I mean, they were really specific about the recommendation. So I find this interesting that within the cohort of extremely well-trained MDs, so OBGYNs and urology fertility docs and OBGYNs, you see a split. It has nothing to do with whether or not the physician was male or female or their training or their institution, none of that. There just seemed to be a sort of even split between the two. Now, granted, it wasn't the largest sample size that I could have obtained, and yet I do find it interesting that there's this split in the opinion about this. One group, the group that said, no, pelvic position doesn't really matter, don't worry about it, it's not going to influence the rates of fertilization, argued that the sperm swim very quickly and that if they are released near the cervix, they're going to swim very quickly toward the egg in order to fertilize it, regardless of pelvic position. The other group said, well, yes, sperm swim quickly, and even if they're released right at the entry to the cervix, that the sperm still have a long distance to go. Again, if you were to scale this according to the size of the sperm versus the size of a human body, an entire human body, what you'd scale it to is the distance between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it needs to undergo that basically within 24 hours or so. Although, as we mentioned earlier, sperm can survive quite a while inside of the woman's body, maybe 3 or 5 days at least. So in both cases, they acknowledge it's a long distance. But on the one hand, you have a group of experts that are saying the sperm more or less know what to do and are going to do it regardless of the position of the woman after ejaculation inside her. And the other group saying, no, we want to do everything we can to bias the likelihood that the sperm will fertilize the egg. Okay. Well, setting aside the basic argument that tilting back of the pelvis and lying stationary or so for about 15 minutes after sexual intercourse and ejaculation is not an expensive endeavor, although it requires a little bit of time, and it forces people to remain motionless or close to motionless, and they're not up and around and moving about. Aside from that, it's a relatively low investment. So one argument is, well, if it could bias the likelihood of fertilization at all, and people want to get pregnant, why wouldn't they do that? Okay, so that's a reasonable argument, but it doesn't really point to the mechanism. The arguments that point to a potential mechanism are that, if you recall what we were talking about when we talked about sperm quality involves a bunch of different measures like concentration of sperm per milliliter semen, morphology of those sperm, how many are forward motile. It turns out that in any one ejaculate sample, the total number of forward motile and yet fast forward motile sperm that are also of the highest quality morphology is actually quite low. And so the idea here is that you want to get as many sperm of the highest quality swimming toward the egg because those sperm stand the highest probability of fertilizing that egg. And in fact, this relates to some of the discussion we were having earlier about behavioral do's and don'ts for sake of increasing the probability of fertilization. And the one that is most important here is cannabis. It turns out that the data on cannabis really do support the idea that some of you may have heard from parents and teachers. I don't know. I did hear this from parents and teachers that cannabis can disrupt the swimming styles of sperm in ways that are not supportive of fertilization, that it can turn more of the sperm into twitchers. Although when I learned about this, I was not informed of the word twitchers. What I was told is that if you use cannabis, that the sperm don't know which direction to go, that they're confused, almost sort of implying that the sperm themselves are high on cannabis. Well, that's certainly not the argument that I'm making here, but it does seem to be the case that people who use cannabis, even once, the sperm that are generated during that particular month or 2 months during which or after which they use cannabis have less forward motility and possibly altered morphology as well. Okay, I want to be very clear. I did not say that if you use cannabis once, you are forever disrupting the motility and morphology of your sperm. I did not say that. What I said is that if you use cannabis once, then the sperm that are generated in the 60 days after that cannabis use are going to have a higher incidence of disrupted motility and perhaps morphology as well. Okay, remember, sperm are continually generated every 60 days or so. And so if you use cannabis once, you are not forever disrupting your sperm. But if you are using cannabis and then you are looking to conceive in the next 60 days, you are going to be reducing, we think significantly so, the number of quality forwardly motile sperm. So the simple takeaway from this is avoid cannabis use. Although if you are going to use cannabis, and again, there are medical uses of cannabis and beneficial uses of cannabis for certain populations. It can be bad for other populations. We talked about that in the Huberman Lab podcast, all about cannabis. But if you're going to use cannabis, you should try and abstain from cannabis in the 2 months prior to the attempt to fertilize and get pregnant. Now, I'm not aware of any data on how cannabis use by the woman can influence the likelihood of fertilization and pregnancy. And I want to couch this whole discussion around cannabis under the umbrella of something that came up in the episode that I did on cannabis, which is that for about half of people out there, male and female, okay, so here we're not distinguishing by biological sex, about half of people that use cannabis report it as an aphrodisiac. It makes them want to have sexual intercourse more than if they don't use cannabis. And for the other half, it actually has the opposite effect by way of an influence on a hormone called prolactin, which suppresses the dopamine system, the testosterone, and the estrogenic system. And so this whole idea that cannabis is an aphrodisiac seems to be true for about half of the human population and not for the other half of the human population. So I mention that because I know a number of people use cannabis as an aphrodisiac. They like to use cannabis before intercourse. It was actually very surprising to me to discover when I researched that cannabis episode that approximately 15%